November 16th, 1957 was the first day of deer hunting season that year. And it was a day when basically the entire male population of the town would have been out in the woods hunting deer, as Ed knew. Ed came in, asked to buy half a gallon of antifreeze, which Bernie Swarton poured out for him and wrote out a receipt.
One time he did see Mother with a bloody apron on, and that made a lasting impression on him.
Seeing his mother standing there, cutting it open, and she turned slowly around and looked at him, and that memory, that image, remained powerfully alive in his imagination throughout his life. You know, his gigantic mother standing there, brandishing this razor-sharp butcher knife with the entire front of her body just dripping with the blood and guts of this butchered animal. They were pretending to be his mother.
She is the mother of one of the most depraved killers of all time, the model for Norman Bates' mother in Psycho, the inspiration for Buffalo Bill's woman suit in Silence of the Lambs. Augusta Gein was a God-fearing woman who tried to instill in her son that sex was evil and women were instruments of the devil. In doing so, she helped create a monster, Ed Gein. But who was Augusta Gein, and how did her obsession about purity and sin create a child who would become a man who turned the defilement of human bodies into an art form? Augusta Gein was born in 1878 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. She was one of 8 children of Amelia and Frederick Lurk, German immigrants from Prussia who had left their homeland in the Great Old Lutheran Exodus. Lutherans teach that every human thought and deed is infected with sin, and because of this, all humanity deserves eternal damnation in hell. Germans were the largest immigrant group to settle in Wisconsin in the 19th century. On December 11th, 1900, Augusta married George Philip Gein, whose mother was a German immigrant. She gave birth to their first son, Henry George Gein, in 1902. George Gein worked various jobs, including a carpenter, tanner, and insurance salesman. But he was an alcoholic and a timid man who found it hard to hold down a job. Augusta ran a small grocery store, and at home, she ruled the house. Realizing she had made a mistake in marrying George, but unable to leave him because of her strict, increasingly religious beliefs, Augusta began to despise all men. She reportedly dreamed of having a baby girl, but when her second child, born in August 1906, turned out to be a boy, she decided Edward Theodore Gein would not be like other males. She was overprotective and babied her son, who grew up to be shy and sensitive, worshipping his mother.
Mr. Gein had a very strange relationship with his mother. It was a love-hate relationship. He listened to her and worshipped her and followed her very closely.
She was a religiously devout, if not fanatical woman. Very, very domineering, very, very strong-willed. I mean, she completely dominated her husband, as well as her 2 sons, Gein and his brother Henry.
Around 1915, Augusta sold the grocery store in La Crosse and moved the family to an isolated farmhouse outside Plainfield when Ed was 8 years old.
One reason, apparently, she insisted that the family move from La Crosse.
Around this time, one day, Ed disobeyed his mother's rule and snuck into the slaughter shed to find Augusta and George with a pig carcass hanging upside down. When Augusta sliced the pig down the center to release its intestines, Ed reportedly experienced sexual pleasure. Ed and Henry were not allowed to leave the farm, except to go to school, where Ed was an excellent reader, but he got bullied for his shyness, his lazy eye, and a growth on his tongue that affected his speech. Each afternoon when they returned, Augusta would remind her sons about the evils of drinking and women, reading Bible passages which supported her lectures.
Augusta would preach a lot out of the book of Revelations that said that women were whores, women were tramps, women were definitely evil beings out to, hurt people.
If Ed tried to make friends, Augusta would scold him and say the person came from a bad family and remonstrate that he didn't want to be a loser. She also told him that he should remain a virgin because sex was sinful and would lead to eternal damnation. Gein dropped out of school after the 8th grade, and he and Henry became full-time hands around the farm and did odd jobs around town as handymen. Ed hung windows, patched roofs, painted houses, and repaired fences. In 1940, their father George died from a heart attack at the age of 66, after which the brothers increased their handyman work. Ed also worked for a road building contractor. His employers described him as odd, but polite and dependable.
What kind of a man did you know him as?
Well, a man is a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in a man, he seems to be a little odd.
Odd.
Odd,
Do you
yeah.
ever suspect anything like this? Or?
No, I'd say he was more or less a pleasant man who would be a nice man to talk to, or somebody who would like to have around. He seems to be a harmless fella,
The Plainfield community trusted the brothers and regarded them as reliable, if a little odd, although Henry was more sociable. As Ed babysat for neighbors, Henry started dating a divorced woman who had 2 children. Henry was making plans to move in with the woman and began criticizing his overbearing mother's hold over his younger brother, claiming the mother and son were best friends. Then 4 years after their father's death, the brothers were burning brush on the farm, and the blaze went out of control. Ed reported to the local police that he had lost sight of his brother in the inferno. But when they came to investigate, they found Henry's body with injuries to his head. The death was ruled an accident, and no autopsy was ever performed. Augusta Gein was in declining health, and Ed devoted himself to taking care of her. At the same time, he was avidly reading books on grave robbing, head shrinking, and human anatomy. On December 29, 1945, age 67, Augusta Gein finally died from a stroke. Ed, at the time was 39, boarded up her bedroom and sitting rooms as museums and shrines, and buried her with a headstone engraved Mother. Gein was alone for the first time in his life, and he began a descent into madness, turning his mother's once extremely neat house into a museum of death. After this, Gein began scouting recent obituaries of women his mother's age, and returned to the cemetery to rob their recently buried bodies. Gein's legend as one of the most deranged and depraved serial killers of all time had begun. If you want to hear about the grave robbings and killings in detail, check out my previous episode where I dive into the crimes themselves. As for Ed's house, it was burned to the ground in 1955 shortly after his arrest. There were actually plans to make the house into a haunted attraction before it got demolished.
All the local people wanted was to forget the horrors and bury the past. Ed Gein's house was put up for auction. Days before the big sale, Ed's house burned to the ground.
I am glad that the house burned down so that there was always talk of somebody buying it and making a house of horrors and charging money to go through it. And I'm glad it's gone so that that part was not carried out.
Flames devoured the building, but not the legend. Like a plague of locusts, crowds kept returning to the Gein farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The shy little bachelor had seized a dark corner in American folklore.
Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this little 2-part Ed Gein series. I just wanted to remaster the story because it is one of the most gruesome and interesting cases in true crime history. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch y'all next week. Peace out.